My lords, the end of the cycle, the Reckoning, is potentially the most dangerous and powerful entity to have taken note of our galaxy. Today I shall attempt to tease out what its motives are. Does it actually wish to end the cycle? What is the cycle? And what happens if it completes its goal? Let's start by addressing what it is. The Mind Wardens describe the end of the cycle as a cataclysmic force from within the Shroud. A grave matter indeed. There is no greater scourge in the galaxy than that of the End. Its power can manifest in physical reality through the complicity of power-hungry mind invaders. The End inflicts ruin upon the galaxy via the Reckoning, a vicious being composed of psionic energy. Its ultimate goal is the complete annihilation of our existence. Of course, that is somewhat tempered in that the Mind Wardens detest the Shroud. The most apparent takeaway has to be the clear distinction between the Reckoning and the end of the cycle, the Reckoning being the psionic entity that we see spawn in our galaxy and consume life. It's not technically the end of the cycle itself, merely a physical representation of it, an avatar perhaps. Others describe the end of the cycle. At the very centre of the Shroud itself dwells the end of the cycle, an amalgamation of all psionic will. It is a greater force of balance among the various domains of this dimension. Without ends, there can be no beings. Now that's an interesting thread to pull on. Is the end of the cycle indeed an amalgamation of all of the other psionic entities? Does it simply wish to end the cycle? Is it some sort of balancing act between the other major powers? And does it have any animosity towards Whispers? I've always assumed it does, since it seems to me that Whispers wants to explore and learn as much as it possibly can about the galaxy. The end of the cycle wishes to simply end it. But I think we need to discuss the concept of galactic cycles. We'll do that, but first let's touch on the earliest dated reference to the end of the cycle. This comes from the Zeroni text. However, they are riddled with nuance. I'll read from one of the Zeroni archives word for word for you. On the brink of defeat, the Divine decided upon their ultimate plan, the end of the cycle. The growth of the black hole in the galactic core would be accelerated to consume the galaxy as soon as possible. At worst, the Saviours and every other species in the galaxy would be destroyed, leaving the Divine to rule the Shroud for a vast but finite time. It was, however, possible that the expansion would become self-sustaining, consuming not just the galaxy, but the entire universe itself. This would provide a source of energy which may not be infinite, but would at least come close enough to make no practical difference. I think the nuance here is particularly important. The Divine decided upon their ultimate plan, the end of the cycle. The Zeroni texts don't stress that they pacted with a being or made some sort of deal with the end of the cycle. It is written as though the Zeroni decided upon their ultimate plan, and were not simply following the orders of something else. However, it is important to stress that prior to this, we know the Zeroni had met and potentially been influenced by Shroud entities. Of course, we don't know which Shroud entities they met, but we do know that they met some. Based on this text, a much smaller psionic crystal has been located in some sort of laboratory. The Zeroni who recorded their findings were extremely frustrated. Their research had been ridiculed by their peers and was largely discredited. These researchers believed that the Zeroni were no longer the only entities in the Shroud, and that the collective fears and desires of their entire race were coalescing into distinct, sapient entities. Yearning to grow stronger, these entities have begun to subtly influence the emotions and thoughts of suitable Zeroni, slowly causing their behaviours to become more extreme, and this may have directly caused the Zeroni Civil War. Now this is incredibly interesting. The collective fears and desires of their entire race were coalescing into distinct sapient entities, and my takeaway from that is that the gods were sort of spawned into existence. After all, the Zeroni, we believe, are the oldest sentient race that have existed in our galaxy, circa at least 100 million years ago. If they were also the first psionics, which is what we believe, perhaps they spawned the entities that we know to exist today. We do know that the Zeroni are directly linked to one of the Shroud gods called the Outsider. Whether or not they're also linked to the end of the cycle or some of the other patrons, we don't know. but it's always been my thought that that is the case. The Zeroni somehow became the entities that we can now meet in the Shroud. But let's circle back to cycles. We assume that when the end of the cycle refers to wishing to literally end the cycle, that ending the galactic cycle is the goal. We know from certain documents, namely the curator's text on the Holy Prophet Zarqualan, there have been at least 41 cycles. The text reads as follows. Symbols of Worship, 102nd edition. Zarqualan, renowned holy figure of indeterminate species, worshipped as a divine prophet by at least 7 distinct galactic religions during the 4th Integrum, 32nd cycle of Kavaba. Ultimate fate unknown, but references in historical records cease after the 38th cycle. History's heavily debated since at least the early 41st cycle, dismissed by many today as a fable or legend. Now, what these cycles actually represent is incredibly difficult to determine. For example, are they stellar cycles, i.e. the time it takes place for a planet to orbit its star? This is unlikely since they're used so universally, and of course each star system will have different stellar bodies orbiting at different rates. It's potentially likely to represent the time it takes for a star system to orbit the central cluster. This for Sol would be in the region of 250 million years. However, that also seems unlikely, for the same reasons. Different systems will orbit at different rates. And the oldest precursor we've been able to date is the Voltum, at a mere 12 million years old. Therefore, setting a cycle at 250 million years perhaps seems unreasonable. I think that a cycle most likely represents the rise and fall of dominant species and/or empires throughout the galaxy. Not to go off on a tangent here, but it does somewhat raise the question that if Zarqualan was prominent in the 32nd to 38th cycle, does that mean we are now in the 41st, as described in the Curator records? This would mean that the fallen empires have witnessed approximately 9 galaxies rise and fall before us, which puts a cycle in the region of roughly 10,000 years, which is clearly a really small number when discussing galaxies and begs the question, what happened around 400,000 years ago? Nothing that I can think of, but perhaps that's when the fallen empires began to record history as they knew it, indeed how we know it now, and the first cycle was the beginning of the fallen empire's history. This would make sense, of course, but unless we ask them, we're just not going to know. Now, there are other mentions of cycles. The Cybrex, for example, provide us with details about their rise. They state this was 612,421 cycles ago. In this case, we know that they mean Sol cycles, as it lines up with their rise and fall approximately 600,000 years ago, so it seems that they just translated for us. The only other pertinent mention of cycles is in a text regarding a psionic empire delving into the Shroud. They specifically state, "The nature of our existence is laid bare, a multiverse where thousands of galaxies like our own are locked in an endless cycle of conflict. It begins, it ends, and then begins again." Clearly, that is a reasonable representation for how we view our galaxy. Nevertheless, enough talk about cycles and speculation. Let's actually look at what happens if an empire pacts with the end of the cycle. Our best example of this is via an empire that we designated the Endbringers, or the Blessed Savantian Order. They were a civilization long haunted by the so-called apocalyptic Shroud. This shroud devastated their neighbouring planet, and ultimately the Savantians would succumb to a dark psionic obsession when discovering that they were the subjects of an ancient alien experiment. They were driven by the whispers of a malevolent entity that we would later know to be the end of the cycle. The Savanti would undergo a radical transformation, mutating themselves and purging any dissenters to harmonise with the Shroud's voice. This descent into madness would culminate in a grand covenant with the sole goal of saturating the galaxy with the aura of the end, with the ultimate goal that this would successfully trigger a total galactic implosion that would leave the universe silent and dead. Indeed, the record ends with the following: "A glorious rebirth is upon us, promised from the time of our great awakening. Before us, all existence is consumed by the void. Erasure and annihilation have become the galaxy's only remaining laws. One by one, entire worlds collapse into the nothingness from which they once came. We are the last to be taken in. It is beautiful." We see it already in its throes of a new fragile form. The end has come. Now starts the beginning, the obliteration of all that is not us. Very harrowing indeed, and certainly a clear signal that the end of the cycle is not remotely a benevolent entity. Now let's touch on the powers that the End gives its patrons, starting with the Aura of the End. The Aura of the End, like other psionic auras, can be spread via planets with psionic people on them. The more people on the planet and the happier they are, the higher the intensity of the aura. The End of the cycle, however, will also be able to spread its aura via fleets. The other patrons don't have this ability, and essentially what it means is, even across vast distances, the aura of the End can still spread, as long as you have a fleet in said position. The aura will inflict horrendous hull damage on enemy ships, and should it touch a planet, it will drastically impact upkeep of jobs and stability. Conversely, it offers great boons for any allied empire, including the empire spreading it. It will decrease ship upkeep and massively increase resources from jobs and stations. Remember that the End's final goal is to have this aura spread into every single system. It is at this point that we believe the obliteration of all will occur. But that is not the only tool that the End of the cycle offers you. Simply by making a covenant with the creature, you will see incredible increases in resources from jobs, resources from stations, naval capacity, monthly influence, and starbase capacity. Of course, remember you have 50 years with which to complete your goals, and should these boons not be enough, on top of this, the End of the cycle also offers powers. Creation will create a size 20 Gaia world with 1,000 pops. Fractalization will increase your Shroud aura output by 100%. Distortion will increase your jump drive range by 100%, and intensification will increase your monthly aura intensity by 50 and disable all Shroud seals for 3 years. They are incredibly powerful. There's one final thing I want to touch on regarding the End of the cycle, and that's its relationship with the Toxic God, as there is clear animosity here, and I think this potentially relates back to the Zeroni. We know from the Knights of the Toxic God histories that a knight would meet the End of the cycle during their quest, and the following would occur. The record states that the creature spoke. "Thou wouldst spurn my help, a blight upon thine house." The knight felt his consciousness being wrenched from his body and set adrift. For what felt like eons, he floated aimlessly through the Shroud, unable to control his movements. Finally, he came across another entity. Where the Stellaris of secrets had been mystifying yet magnificent, this being was terrifying. "It is not yet your time," it boomed. "Go home. You are not yet fit for this bargain." And with that, the knight was returned to his body. This meeting, my lords, was the first time that the Knights of the Toxic God would come into contact with the End of the cycle. And it is interesting that this meeting leaves an impression upon the End of the cycle, as, if the Knights become psionic and venture into the Shroud to pact with said Shroud entity, the End of the cycle is 5 times more likely to appear and bargain with them. Now, is this increased chance due to the Knights learning of and becoming fascinated by the End of the cycle, or is it the End of the cycle realizing that these Knights are capable and have indeed been designated for something far more dangerous? That capability culminating in the death of the End of the cycle itself? Perhaps, perhaps not. In any case, I feel like this interaction is somewhat of a subversion. The End of the cycle is trying to take the Knights away from their original deity, the Toxic God, which may or may not be because the End of the cycle knows that the Toxic God intends to kill it. Probably not, or the End of the cycle would perhaps just destroy the Knights' empire in the first place. Nevertheless, the interaction occurs, and it is the why which eludes us. This also makes me wonder, who was the Sussurrer of Secrets? Why did it appear? And was it prompted to by the End of the cycle, or was it a mere coincidence? Perhaps there is a hidden sect in the galaxy who does the End of the cycle's bidding, some sort of dark brotherhood perhaps. This is all rather important, as the Knights' end goal becomes clear when they go down the path of cosmogenesis, which, remember, in theory the End of the cycle potentially hopes to prevent via the Reckoning, which would either complete the goal of the End of the cycle in 50 years, or result in the Reckoning spawning and destroying the Knights. therefore meaning it's likely the Knights would never be able to achieve cosmogenesis and escape our reality. The next point is also important. Regardless whether or not the Knights have pacted with the Shroud entity, the Toxic God will meet them on the other side of the event horizon, following cosmogenesis. They will never meet another Shroud entity, they will always meet the Toxic God, and importantly they will meet the Toxic God in the Shroud, despite the Toxic God stating that it is not its home. The Toxic God states upon meeting the Knights, "After the violence of the crossing, the other side is quiet. An unnatural stillness surrounds us, the needle is damaged, but no critical components were lost. Between one moment and the next, telemetry reports begin to flood in. It is here that the one we named Toxic God, the object of our quest. Our Knights stand petrified and uncertain, while all around us is draped in the familiar decor of the Shroud. It speaks. Mine champions, thy coming here was foretold, and thou hast proven their worth. A million questions flood into our mind, and a single answer comes in reply. We were to craft its weapon, the Horizon Needle. Now we're to fight alongside it. We're to embark on a journey across dimensions, a crusade against the horrors of the multiverse. The Shroud is not its home, but harbours the legacy of those that were divine. Something that could bring about the end of our home galaxy. Something that needs slaying. It seizes our systems, its power immense. The needle is turned into a Horizon Lance, a weapon sharp enough to pierce the heart of any foe. Our quest has just begun." There are some key takeaways from this text. The Shroud is not its home, but harbours the legacy of those who were divine, something that could bring about the end of our home galaxy. This screams to me that we were right about the Zeroni Divine becoming the Shroud Gods, specifically spawning the end of the cycle. And we also know that the Knights are successful in slaying said entity, as the record suggests that in a post-cosmogenesis galaxy, the end of the cycle is simply not present. I can only assume that this means it has been slain. Now, originally when we made contact with the Outsider, and we found out that the Outsider was indeed Zeroni in origin, I took that to mean, by definition, it meant that the Zeroni weren't the other Shroud Gods, because there was this Outsider. But I've thought on this a little more. The Outsider was the Zeroni that we contacted via the Astral Rift, which, in theory, is not in our galaxy, it's not even in our timeline, which lines up with the fact that this Zeroni is the Outsider. It's the Outsider because it's not the Zeroni, at least not the Zeroni that we knew in our galaxy. I maintain that the Shroud Gods that we know of, the entities that exist, the Cradle of Souls, the Eater of Worlds, the End of the Cycle, the Whispers, all of them, they were created from the Zeroni. Whether or not individual Zeroni became the entities, or whether or not the Zeroni thoughts and feelings manifested these gods, I maintain that the Shroud Gods are indeed the Zeroni, and the End of the Cycle is merely just a subset of that. Clearly the most powerful, perhaps directly related to the Divine, but nevertheless Zeroni in origin. As ever, my lords, I await your thoughts.